In the unforgiving land of the Old West, respect was as fragile as the thin line between life and death, and reputation was the only wealth many men carried. That is why, when a widow chose to remarry, her decision became the subject of every whisper in town. Her new husband was not a man of fortune, nor was he a figure of power. He was simple, weathered by the desert sun, and carrying scars that told stories of hardship rather than triumph. To the widow, he was a man of quiet strength, someone who offered her stability and kindness after years of sorrow. But to those around her, especially her son-in-law, he was an easy target for scorn. The son-in-law, proud and quick-tempered, could not accept that his mother-in-law had chosen this man. He sneered in front of others, declaring that even his own father would have been a better choice than the one she had made. His words cut deep, not only toward the new husband, but toward the widow herself, who now stood torn between love and loyalty, between the whispers of society and the whispers of her own heart. In the Old West, such words were not just insults, they were challenges to a man's worth. The townsfolk, ever eager for drama, gathered in saloons and around dusty porches to debate the matter. Some laughed at the widow's choice, saying she had traded security for weakness. Others pitied her, convinced she had been blinded by desperation and loneliness. But no one, not a single voice among them, understood the truth of her decision. She had not chosen wealth or power, but resilience. And resilience, though mocked by many, was the only currency that survived in a land where storms could wipe out fortunes overnight. The new husband bore the ridicule in silence. He had seen worse than words in his lifetime. He had faced hunger, drought, and men who settled disputes with bullets instead of insults. But silence is not always weakness, and though he stood quietly under the weight of mockery, there was a fire burning in his chest. He knew that one day, by action and not by speech, he would prove his worth to all who doubted him. For in the Old West, a man's truth was revealed not in what he claimed to be, but in how he stood when everything was against him. And so the stage was set, not merely for a conflict of pride, but for a lesson that would test love, loyalty, and the measure of a man. The widow's choice, her son-in-law's scorn, and the husband's silence would soon collide in a way none of them expected. And when the dust settled, the town would learn that the true strength of a man is not in the image he projects, but in the courage he carries when the world seeks to strip him of dignity. The widow's new husband rose before dawn every morning, his footsteps steady on the wooden floors of the small ranch house. He carried himself with the quiet determination of a man who had survived more than most cared to know. While others mocked his presence, he bent his back to the land, working from sunup to sundown, refusing to let scorn break his resolve. His silence was not surrender. It was patience, the kind forged by years of hardship in a world where every drop of sweat was a prayer for survival. Yet the whispers lingered, and the cruel words of his stepson echoed louder than the sounds of cattle and wind. The son-in-law, full of pride and contempt, took every opportunity to humiliate him. At family gatherings, he laughed loudly, comparing the man unfavorably to his own late father. He boasted that his bloodline was strong, that his heritage carried weight, and that the widow's choice was a disgrace. His words were sharpened not only by arrogance, but by the certainty that others would agree with him. And indeed, many townsfolk nodded silently, unwilling to defend the quiet man who refused to defend himself. But in the widow's eyes, there was a different story. She saw beyond the worn clothes, beyond the calloused hands, into the heart of a man who carried loyalty like armor. She had chosen not the strongest, not the wealthiest, but the one who could endure. For in the Old West, storms of dust and fire consumed the proud just as quickly as the humble. And it was endurance, unyielding endurance, that kept a family alive. Still, her heart ached at the cruel divide between her son-in-law and her new husband, knowing that pride and love were now locked in a battle neither would yield. The new husband bore it all in silence, though silence was its own kind of wound. He had buried friends under desert soil, faced men who raised guns at him for less than a word, and yet the ridicule of family struck deeper than bullets. He longed to earn respect, not through anger, but through action, for he knew that the West did not reward loud men, but those who stood firm when the earth itself turned hostile. His chance to prove himself would come, though neither he nor his mockers yet knew how. And so, the days carried on with tension simmering beneath the surface. The widow prayed for peace, the son-in-law thrived on pride, and the new husband waited quietly, carrying the weight of judgment like a saddle he refused to shed. In the distance, however, the land itself was shifting, preparing to test them all. For in the Old West, fate never came gently. It came with dust storms, with fire, and with trials that revealed the truth of every man's heart. The first sign of change came with the land itself. The summer sun bore down mercilessly, cracking the earth and thinning the water in the wells. Cattle grew lean, pastures turned brittle, and the ranch, once stable under the widow's careful watch, stood on the edge of collapse. Neighbors spoke of selling off their herds, of abandoning the land to the drought, and whispers spread that the widow had cursed herself by marrying a man unfit to lead. Each insult pressed harder, leaving her torn between love and the crushing judgment of the town. The son-in-law seized the moment. He laughed in the saloon, raising his glass high, telling anyone who would listen that his late father would never have allowed such ruin. He claimed that a true man would have secured water, saved the cattle, and proven his worth. His voice grew louder with each drink, convincing others that the widow's choice had doomed them all. Yet, behind his boasts, he never once lifted a hand to help. Words were his weapon, but words alone do not mend fences, nor do they save dying herds. The widow's husband, though scorned, did not falter. He rode out each dawn, searching the land for signs of water, his eyes scanning the horizon for hope. He worked tirelessly, digging into dry earth, patching broken lines, and leading cattle miles for a sip of water. Each evening he returned with his body beaten, but his spirit unbroken. The townsfolk mocked his efforts, but the widow saw the truth. While others surrendered, he fought quietly, with the grit of a man who would rather die working than live defeated. One evening, as the sun bled red across the plains, the son-in-law confronted him in front of the widow. He declared that the man was useless, that no amount of labor could save the ranch, and that only someone with true bloodline and legacy could restore their fortune. His words burned with venom, striking at every wound the man carried. But the husband, standing steady with dirt still clinging to his hands, did not reply with anger. He simply turned back to the land, for he knew the earth, not pride, would decide a man's worth. And as the drought deepened, fate prepared the trial that would silence mockery and reveal truth. The widow's heart trembled with both fear and hope, for she sensed that the days ahead would test not only her husband's endurance, but also the very foundation of what her family believed made a man worthy. The Old West was merciless, but it was also just, and justice was about to come riding across the plains. The drought did not ease. Weeks passed, and the land became a battlefield between man and nature. Dust coated every surface, cattle cried out in hunger, and the wells threatened to run dry. Families across the town looked for someone to blame, and the widow's husband became the easiest target. They called him cursed, said the ranch was doomed under his hand, and repeated the son-in-law's cruel words until they became echoes that haunted the streets. Yet still, the man worked, his silence a defiance sharper than any insult. The widow's heart was torn. She believed in her husband's strength, yet the constant mockery of her son-in-law gnawed at her spirit. Each family gathering became a trial, with the young man raising his voice against the one she loved, boasting of what his own father would have done, shaming her for choosing differently. But each time, the husband remained calm, his eyes steady, his hands still devoted to the land. He did not fight with words, for he knew words were fleeting, only actions endured. One day, as the sun scorched the fields, the husband rode further than ever before. The land stretched empty for miles, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than survival. Hours passed, and at last, he found it, a shallow stream, hidden in a canyon, still flowing despite the drought. His heart surged with hope. It was not enough to save the entire region, but it could save their ranch, if he could find a way to bring the water home. The journey back was long and grueling, but he carried the vision with him, a vision that no insult could take away. He returned that night, weary and covered in dust, but with determination blazing in his eyes. The widow saw it instantly. He had found something, a chance, a miracle hidden in the harshness of the West. Though he spoke few words, the conviction in his voice silenced even her doubts. He promised her that the ranch would endure, and she believed him. But when word spread of what he had discovered, the son-in-law twisted the story. He told the town that luck, not skill, had led the man to the stream. He mocked him further, declaring that only a true man could bring water across miles of desert. The townsfolk laughed with him, blind to the truth. Yet the husband did not falter. He had faced worse than ridicule, and now, with a plan burning in his chest, he was ready to prove his worth not with luck, but with labor. The next days turned into a trial of strength and faith. With nothing but his own hands, a shovel, and the orphan boy who had begun to follow him like a shadow, the widow's husband began to carve a trench from the canyon to the ranch. The task seemed impossible, miles of rock and dirt, under the blazing sun, with no guarantee of success. The townsfolk scoffed, calling him mad, while the son-in-law mocked louder than ever. But the man did not stop. Each strike of his shovel was a vow, each bead of sweat a declaration. The orphan boy, though small, worked beside him, carrying buckets, gathering stones, and refusing to leave his side. The widow watched from a distance, her heart swelling with both fear and pride. She saw her husband's body weaken under the weight of the task, yet his spirit only grew stronger. In his determination, she saw the truth she had always known. This was a man who did not bend to pride or mockery, but who fought quietly for the ones he loved. The son-in-law tried to interfere. One evening, he arrived at the trench with a group of men, jeering and taunting, declaring that the work was pointless. He warned the husband to stop before he wasted what little strength remained in him. But the man did not rise to the bait. He lifted his head, met his accuser's eyes, and returned to his work without a word. That silence, heavier than any outburst, struck deeper than all the son-in-law's insults combined. Days stretched into weeks, and the trench grew longer, inching its way toward the ranch. Blisters covered the husband's hands, his clothes hung in tatters, and yet the spark in his eyes never dimmed. Even the townsfolk began to fall silent, watching with awe as the impossible slowly became real. Some whispered that perhaps this man, mocked and dismissed, carried a strength they had never understood. Respect, once denied, began to stir quietly among them. And then, one fateful evening, the water flowed. It trickled at first, then surged, filling the trench, and racing toward the ranch like life itself returning to the land. The widow wept with relief, the orphan shouted with joy, and the ranch breathed again. The cattle drank, the earth softened, and hope, long buried under dust, rose once more. The silence that followed in town was deafening. The man they had mocked had done what none of them dared to try. The water running through the trench was more than a victory for the ranch. It was proof that persistence could silence pride. The widow's husband stood at the edge of the flowing stream, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, but his eyes steady with quiet triumph. For the first time, the townsfolk no longer laughed. They watched in awe as life returned to the land, whispering among themselves that perhaps they had misjudged the man they once mocked. Respect had begun to bloom in the very soil where doubt had been sown. The widow felt her heart swell as she saw the cattle drink deeply, their thirst quenched, their strength slowly returning. She turned to her husband, no longer seeing him as the man others ridiculed, but as the man who had fought for her, for their home, and for their future. She knew her choice had not been a mistake. She had chosen not a man of wealth, but a man of endurance. And endurance had brought them salvation. But the son-in-law could not accept the truth so easily. His pride burned hotter than the desert sun, and the sight of his stepfather's victory felt like a dagger twisting in his chest. He shouted that it was all luck, that anyone could have found the stream, that hard work meant nothing compared to true legacy. His words, once sharp enough to wound, now rang hollow against the evidence flowing before everyone's eyes. Yet his anger only grew, threatening to consume him entirely. The townsfolk began to turn on him. Where once they had nodded at his jeers, now they looked at him with unease. They saw not strength in his pride, but weakness in his refusal to acknowledge what stood plain before him. His father's name, once his weapon, could not save him from the truth that another man's labor had succeeded where his boasting had failed. Still, his bitterness refused to die. The widow's husband did not respond with triumph or arrogance. He simply returned to his work, ensuring the trench remained strong and the water continued to flow. He had nothing to prove with words. His actions spoke louder than any boast ever could. Yet he knew the conflict with his stepson was not finished. Pride, when left unchecked, always found a way to rise again, and the Old West had a way of turning pride into peril. The days that followed were filled with renewal. Grass began to sprout where dust had reigned, cattle grew stronger, and the ranch once again looked like a place of life rather than despair. The widow walked through the fields with a quiet smile, knowing that her husband's resilience had saved them from ruin. Even the townsfolk, who once mocked her decision, began to speak with respect, admitting that they had underestimated the man who had carried their scorn with silence. But for the son-in-law, the humiliation was unbearable. He spent his evenings in the saloon, drowning his bitterness in whiskey, his words growing darker with every glass. He declared that he would not be overshadowed, that he would prove once and for all that his stepfather was unworthy of respect. The laughter of the saloon crowd only fueled his anger, for deep down, he knew their laughter was not at his stepfather. It was at him. The widow's husband, however, did not live for their approval. He poured his energy into rebuilding the ranch, training the orphan boy who worked beside him each day. The boy's loyalty never wavered, and together they formed a bond that grew stronger with every task shared. The man taught him not only the skills of survival, how to mend fences, care for cattle, and ride with balance, but also the deeper lessons of dignity, patience, and strength without pride. The widow saw it all unfold, her heart torn between joy and sorrow. She rejoiced in her husband's quiet victories, yet she feared for the growing storm in her son-in-law's heart. She prayed that the boy's example, the man's endurance, and the evidence of their survival would soften him. But pride is a hard stone, and once it takes root, it rarely yields to love or reason. And so, beneath the beauty of renewal, another shadow lingered. The son-in-law's bitterness, now hardened into rage, would soon demand a reckoning. And in the Old West, reckonings were never gentle. They came with sharp words, steel, and choices that revealed the soul of every man. The ranch flourished under the steady flow of water, yet peace remained fragile. The widow's husband worked tirelessly, his back bent beneath the sun, while the orphan boy grew stronger under his guidance. Together, they forged a rhythm of life that felt almost unbreakable. Yet every step was shadowed by the son-in-law's simmering resentment. He watched from a distance, his pride festering like a wound that refused to heal. The success of the ranch did not soften his heart. It hardened it further, for each blade of green grass mocked his pride. One evening, as the family gathered for supper, the son-in-law's anger boiled over. With clenched fists and a voice trembling with rage, he declared that no amount of water could make a man worthy, that his late father would never have allowed the family name to be tarnished by weakness. His words cut through the room like a knife, leaving silence in their wake. The widow's face paled, her heart breaking as she realized the bitterness in her son-in-law had grown beyond control. The husband, however, did not rise to the bait. He looked into the young man's eyes and saw not strength, but fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being overshadowed by a man who never boasted, never sought glory. With calm words, he reminded him that legacy is not preserved by pride, but by what one leaves behind in the lives of others. But the son-in-law could not hear it. His ears were closed to truth, his heart chained by envy. The orphan boy, sitting quietly at the table, finally spoke. His voice, though small, carried the weight of conviction. He told the son-in-law that respect is not inherited but earned, and that the man he mocked had given more to the land and to the widow than pride ever could. For a moment, the room was still, the words hanging in the air like judgment. The boy's courage revealed what the son-in-law could not bear to admit, that the true weakness lay not in the husband's simplicity, but in his own arrogance. The son-in-law stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The night air carried the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance, but the weight of his rage remained heavy in the house. The widow wept softly, torn between love for her son-in-law and fear for what his anger might bring. The husband placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his silence once again speaking louder than words. He knew that the storm was not over. The following days were tense, filled with an unease that settled over the ranch like a lingering shadow. The widow's husband continued his work as though nothing had changed, but he remained watchful, his instincts sharpened by years of surviving the harshness of the West. He knew that danger was not always carried by strangers. Sometimes it came from the very ones who shared your table. And in his stepson's pride, he sensed a reckoning that could not be avoided. The son-in-law spent his days in the saloon, his bitterness pouring into every word he spoke. He told anyone who would listen that he would reclaim his family's honor, that his stepfather had stolen respect that was never his to claim. Whiskey fueled his boasts, and soon men began to gather around him, drifters, outlaws, and those who thrived on conflict. Pride, once only words, now found companions willing to turn into action. The townsfolk grew uneasy. They had once joined in the son-in-law's laughter, but now they whispered of danger. They remembered the silence of the widow's husband, the trench he had dug with his own hands, and the water that flowed because of him. They knew the truth, but truth often faltered when pride demanded blood. Some prayed for peace, but in the Old West, prayers were often answered with trials rather than miracles. The widow felt the tension most of all. Each night, she clung to her husband's presence, fearing that her son-in-law's anger would erupt into violence. She begged him to stay away from town, to avoid confrontation, but he only shook his head. A man could not run from pride, not his own, and not another's. He told her that no matter what came, he would stand firm, not with anger, but with the strength that had carried him through every storm. The orphan boy refused to leave his side. He shadowed the man in every chore, every ride, every quiet evening under the stars. He knew the danger that loomed, but his loyalty was stronger than fear. "If they come," he whispered one night, "I will stand with you." The husband looked at him, eyes heavy with both sorrow and pride. He knew the boy spoke the truth, and in that truth, he realized that whatever trial awaited, he would not face it alone. The night the storm broke was eerily still. The moon hung low over the plains, casting silver shadows across the ranch. The widow's husband sat quietly on the porch, his rifle leaning beside him, not as a weapon of aggression, but as a tool of necessity. The orphan boy sat near his feet, wide-eyed but unflinching, his loyalty shining brighter than the lantern that flickered between them. The air itself seemed to thrum with warning, as if the land knew that pride and fury were about to collide. The sound came first as a faint rumble of hooves, then as a thunder that shook the earth. The son-in-law had returned, not alone but flanked by rough men drawn by whiskey and promises. Their shadows stretched long and dark across the ranch yard as they dismounted, their laughter cruel, their eyes sharp with the thrill of confrontation. The widow's heart sank as she saw her son's figure among them, his pride now cloaked in hatred. The husband rose slowly, dusting his worn coat as he stepped down from the porch. He did not reach for his rifle. Instead, he stood tall, his silence louder than the jeers that surrounded him. The son-in-law spat his accusations once more, declaring that the ranch and his family's honor would never belong to a man like him. His voice cracked with fury, but beneath the anger was fear, the fear that the quiet man he despised had already proven himself in ways he never could. The widow cried out, begging her son to stop, but her words fell on deaf ears. The men at his side urged him forward, whispering promises of respect if he took the step he had threatened for so long. The orphan moved closer to the husband, his small body a shield against the wave of hostility. The sight of that boy standing firm shook even the roughest of the drifters, for courage that pure cannot be mocked without shame. In that moment, the standoff became more than a clash of pride. It became a question of legacy. Would violence dictate the future of the family, or would dignity hold its ground against the fury of pride? The answer, though not yet spoken, was written in the steady gaze of the widow's husband, who faced the mob not as a victim, but as a man who had nothing left to prove. The silence before the clash was unbearable. The son-in-law's hand hovered near his holster, his breath ragged, his pride battling with doubt. Every man in the yard felt the weight of that hesitation, for they knew that once steel was drawn, there would be no turning back. The widow's husband did not move. He simply looked into the young man's eyes and spoke for the first time that night. Respect is not given by blood. It is earned by how you live. His voice, calm and steady, cut deeper than any blade. The words struck like a blow. The son-in-law's hand trembled, his fingers brushing the grip of his revolver, but he could not draw. His pride screamed for him to prove himself, yet the truth stood before him, undeniable. The man he had mocked had faced drought, ridicule, and endless labor, and had prevailed. To draw against such a man would not restore honor. It would expose cowardice. His arm fell to his side, his rage collapsing into silence. The outlaws who had followed him shifted uneasily. Without the courage of their leader, they found no reason to fight. One by one, they stepped back, muttering under their breath, unwilling to cross a man who had won respect through endurance rather than fear. The mob that had arrived with threats now scattered like dust in the wind, leaving only the son-in-law standing in the yard, broken not by bullets, but by truth. The widow rushed to her husband's side, tears streaming down her face, while the orphan boy grinned with relief. The man did not celebrate, nor did he gloat. He simply wrapped his arm around the widow and rested his other hand on the boy's shoulder. His victory was not in humiliating his stepson, but in proving that dignity and endurance outlive pride. The land itself seemed to exhale, the silence of danger replaced by the quiet of peace. The son-in-law lowered his head, shame heavy upon him. He turned away without a word, leaving the ranch behind. The widow's husband watched him disappear into the darkness, not with hatred, but with a solemn understanding. For in the Old West, pride often led men down lonely roads, while those who chose endurance left behind a legacy no storm could erase. And on that night, beneath the wide and endless sky, the family found its true foundation, not in bloodline, but in loyalty, resilience, and love. When the dust of conflict finally settled, the truth stood clear. The widow's husband, once mocked as unworthy, had proven that resilience speaks louder than pride. He had endured drought, ridicule, and betrayal, yet his answer to every challenge was not anger, but perseverance. And in that perseverance, he found a strength that no insult could erase. His victory was not only in saving the ranch, but in showing that the measure of a man lies not in how loudly he demands respect, but in how quietly he earns it. The widow, once torn between love and judgment, now saw her choice vindicated before the world. She had chosen not the man who boasted of legacies past, but the one who built a future with his own hands. Her heart swelled with pride, not because others finally recognized his worth, but because she had always seen it, even when the world turned blind. And in her silent faith, she had found her own strength, standing firm beside the man who never faltered. The orphan boy, who had stood by him through labor and danger, carried a lesson that would shape his life forever. He learned that true courage does not come from bloodline or inheritance, but from loyalty, humility, and the decision to stay when it is hardest to stand. In his small hands, the values of dignity and endurance found new life, passed down not through words, but through the living example of a man who refused to break. And the son-in-law, though swallowed by shame, left behind a powerful reminder: pride may roar, but it cannot endure. Wealth fades, names are forgotten, and arrogance collapses under its own weight. But honor, earned through sacrifice, silence, and resilience, remains long after the noise has died. The lesson of that night echoed across the plains. It is not the one who shouts the loudest who is remembered, but the one who stands firm when the world turns against him. If this story moved you, let it linger in your heart. Share in the comments what truth you carried away. Give this video a like if it touched your spirit. And subscribe so you can walk with us through more tales that breathe life into the rugged soul of the Old West. Because stories like this are not just history, they are mirrors, reflecting what it means to endure, to love, and to be truly strong.